Again, Artemis I, it's America's next attempt to get to the moon. This is a crucial demonstration of the rocket, of the spacecraft, in order to eventually get Americans to step foot back on the lunar surface again coming up in the next couple of years. Artemis I, uncrewed. However, this is incredibly important in order for us to get astronauts to the moon here in basically this decade. So here's where we stand so far tonight. No fuel leaks as of now. That has been a rarity in the campaign thus far, and things are really going quite well. I'm listening to the countdown net in my ear right now, and I haven't heard a peep from them in the last about 20 minutes or so, and that's actually a very good thing. No news is good news when it comes to the fueling process. So the core stage, it's about halfway filled right now, the big orange part of the rocket. That will continue to fill for the next couple of hours, and that will load the top half of the rocket here. And then again, right around 12:04 a.m. Central Time, that is when we expect the rocket to take off. Right now, weather is also looking just fine at 80% favorable, Bitch.
So you've been down there quite a bit for launches before, including the one again a few months ago when it didn't go. This is kind of old hat for the locals there in Cape Canaveral, Cocoa Beach, all those spots. Is there a little extra goosebumpage? I know you're feeling that right now, just because of what this mission means and how long it's taken to hopefully tonight finally get it off the ground.
Yeah, there's definitely this has been such a long time coming. You know, this started back in 2012, a decade ago. This was supposed to launch in 2018. We're behind schedule by quite a few years right now. So the anticipation building up to this is immense. There's a lot of excitement too. You drive around Cape Canaveral or Cocoa Beach, a lot of signage, go Artemis. The whole Space Coast is behind this rocket, and we hope to get it off the ground later on tonight. Yeah, really a decade in the making. Now we're less than 6 hours away from reality, assuming that everything continues to move along swimmingly. Again, we're at the Artemis I launch. Artemis I is a critical test flight of a brand new rocket and a brand new spacecraft, which will eventually put humans back on the surface of the moon once again later on this decade. We are testing the SLS rocket. This is the maiden flight. We've had issues prior to this. There have been issues with hydrogen fuel loading. We've had issues with an engine that ended up being a faulty sensor. Tonight, though, as the countdown's progressing rather smoothly, we are completely fueled on liquid hydrogen on the core stage, that big orange part of the rocket. That is fully fueled. It's now in topping mode. Oxygen is about 85% filled at this hour as well. So the fueling process continues. The upper part of the rocket will then be fueled in the next couple of hours. And again, as long as things continue to move on swimmingly, we do expect a on-time launch here on the Florida Space Coast at the Kennedy Space Center at 12:04 a.m. Central Time. Live at the Kennedy Space Center, I'm Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.
Thank you, Kason. Well, T-minus 3 hours from the hopeful launch of Artemis I, the long-awaited next step of America's push to return to the moon. Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart live tonight from Cape Canaveral, Florida. He was there 3 months ago when we tried this last time. We are hoping, Nick, third time is the charm. We're closer than we've ever been to seeing that rocket finally take off.
Yeah, we have gotten past many of the hurdles that we have in previous launch attempts. We didn't have any issues with leaking hydrogen during the fueling of the core stage of the rocket. We also now have successfully fueled the upper stage of the rocket. But it would not be, apparently, an Artemis launch attempt without a hydrogen leak. So here's what we're dealing with right now. This is a very rare scenario. A red team, 2 technicians, are right now being sent to pad 39B. They're being sent there to torque 2 nuts that are on the mobile launch platform. There is a hydrogen leak on one of the valves that's being used to replenish the flow of hydrogen. Hydrogen, it's very, very cold. As it burns off, it has to be expelled from the rocket. Now, in order to keep the hydrogen level at a current or in a steady state, more is constantly replenished onto the rocket. But there is an issue with this valve where there is what they're calling an intermittent leak of hydrogen there. Now, of course, sending a pad to 39B, keep in mind that is a nearly fully fueled launch vehicle, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built by NASA. It doesn't come without risks. So there, of course, going to be some risk with them going to this. They're trained to do this. There's a lot of training that obviously goes into doing this. We do expect them to reach the pad here momentarily. We watched them leave right around 9 o'clock Central Time to the pad. They expect it to take about 15 minutes. We'll keep you updated as we go throughout the rest of the night here on Iowa's News Now on their status. Live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.
Now just about 2.5 hours away from hopefully this thing getting off the launch pad there in Cape Canaveral. Artemis trying to make its way to the moon, an unmanned launch down there in Florida tonight. And hopefully this is the time it goes. Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart tracking that. Nick, at the top of the hour we talked about hydrogen situation, and there was a crew on its way there, some bolts to tighten, something. It's always something like that, right? Any updates there? It sounded like that was going to be a 15-minute job, and maybe they were just arriving on the launch pad not too long ago.
Yeah, they should be finishing up here in the short term. We should get an update on that here shortly. What we do know is that that issue that they're resolving right now at the pad, where they're having to tighten those bolts, it may eat into the launch window. It is a 2-hour window, goes from 12:04 to 2:04 a.m. Central Time. We want to keep you up to there. If that clock hits zero tonight, though, let's talk a little bit more about what Artemis will be doing and the rocket will be doing in the following few minutes. So, at about 6 seconds prior to liftoff, the 4 main engines at the bottom of the rocket will ignite. Those RS-25 engines will ignite. Then, once we reach that T0 mark, that's when those 2 white towers, those solid rocket boosters, that is when they will ignite as well. That's when 8.8 million pounds of thrust will push Artemis into low Earth orbit to start things off. At 2 minutes and 12 seconds after launch, those solid rocket boosters, those side SRBs, will then separate or jettison from the main core stage of the rocket. From that point on, we'll have the main core booster continuing. At 3 minutes and 16 seconds, the very top of the rocket is actually a launch abort motor. If there's an issue, it can carry the crew away. That will abort just after 3 minutes, and the fairings that protect the spacecraft will also jettison. So now Orion is open to the vacuum of space. The core booster will continue to travel through outer space. At about 8 minutes and 3 seconds, the 4 main engines on that core stage will then shut off. And then shortly after, 8 minutes and 15 seconds into flight, that is when the second stage will depart and Orion will begin its journey to the surface of the moon. Live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Weather First Meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now. Yes, right now, about a half an hour ago, what we call the Red Crew, they went out to Pad 39B to tighten these bolts that are on the base of the rocket, the actual mobile launch platform, where there was a leak of hydrogen on one of the valves that fuel hydrogen into the rocket itself. They are literally in the blast danger zone right now trying to tighten these bolts. We should know pretty soon whether or not this will be successful in stopping that leak. But prior to this point, things went very, very well. We'll keep you updated here on this leaking hydrogen situation. Go figure, it has been kind of a theme with previous Artemis launch attempts. We'll see how things break down. We'll keep you updated coming up on Iowa's News Now at 10 o'clock. But for now, live at the Kennedy Space Center, I'm Meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.
Nick, I do have a question for you. Obviously, we're hopefully getting closer to launch, and hopefully Red Crew's taking care of what they need to be taken care of. Are there crowds around there even as it approaches 11 o'clock on East Coast time? Again, people have been waiting years for this launch, another 3 months after August. Yeah, they just added on, whatever. Is there still anticipation, even with this latest hiccup and curve in the road and whatever? People have been waiting 4 years for something like this.
Yeah, I can tell you that we're at the press site, so we're kind of farther away from where crowds may be gathering. But I can tell you that on my way in, at that point, it was about 10 hours prior to launch. And the main highway, 528, that goes from Cocoa Beach to Orlando, there's a stretch there where we have a great view of the rocket. There are already people in RVs setting up. It was less than the previous attempts in August, I will say, but the crowds have definitely come, and I can tell you, just looking at Google traffic, the entrance to the Kennedy Space Center for the launch viewing, it looks pretty busy tonight. So there's certainly a crowd that's coming on down here to watch this launch. Yeah,
going to be a little attrition, but we're going to the moon again. You'll line up for that anytime, Nick. Hope for your sake, certainly things get settled there, and of course we'll talk to you coming up on Iowa's News Now at 10. As Nick said,
a decade in the making now, just hours from reality. I'm Iowa's News Now with the first meteorologist Nick Stewart. We're counting down to launch of Artemis I. We'll keep you updated on how the fueling process is going. We just got a very good update. More on that coming up after the break.
T-minus 2 hours away now from the hopeful launch of Artemis I there on the launch pad in Cape Canaveral, Florida tonight. The long-awaited next step of America's push to return to the moon. Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart is live there tonight from Cape Canaveral, same place he was 3 months ago when NASA last tried this. He's been tracking things. We told you at 9 over on Fox 28 about hydrogen valve, maybe an issue there. Red Crew was going up to tighten some bolts and do whatnot. Sounds like maybe a good update coming from there, Nick.
Yeah, so far things have been moving very well until we had yet again a hydrogen leak at one of the valves that replenish fuel. And again, just a quick summary of why we're here. This is Artemis I. It is the first step to putting humans and Americans back on the surface of the moon sometime later on this decade. We are fueling the SLS rocket. It's the most powerful rocket that NASA has ever built, one of the most powerful rockets ever built in history. We were going very well through the countdown. We then had a leak of hydrogen detected at one of the valves on the mobile launch platform, the platform that the rocket's actually sitting on. They actually had to send a crew, they call it the Red Crew. They were sent to the pad inside of the blast danger zone to tighten those bolts. What they reported back is that the bolts were visibly loose. So that could be why we were having a leak of hydrogen. They torqued the bolts and are now on their way back. The process was set to take about 15 minutes. It took a bit longer, closer to about a half an hour. So this may delay the launch, but I want to stress we have a 2-hour launch window. Officially, that launch window will open at 12:04 a.m. Central Time, but it extends for 2 hours. So this may push things back a little bit. We'll definitely wait until we get a formal update. The countdown clock here will continue to count down until 10 minutes. Once we hit 10 minutes, we'll get a formalized launch time, and then we're good to go for Artemis I. Live at the Kennedy Space Center, Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.
Rebecca, thank you. Well, as we just showed you, Artemis I now on its way to the moon after a spectacular launch. Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart joins us now live from the Kennedy Space Center, where I'm sure you have a lot more ways of describing this morning's launch, Nick. It was something else, wasn't it?
It really was truly a remarkable thing. It was a decade in the making. And finally, a big sigh of relief for everybody here, not only because the rocket is no longer on the launch pad, but it really did a very good job of getting the Orion space capsule on its way to the moon. It'll probably be there in the next couple of days. Here's a recap of last night's launch if you happen to miss it. Excitement was contagious at the Kennedy Space Center Tuesday night as America's next moonshot took flight, setting the tone to soon put Americans back on the surface of the moon later this decade. Seconds after liftoff, the deafening sound of the 8.8 million pounds of thrust reached the crowd. Orion, the spacecraft, was now headed to the moon.
So you guys know I have talked a lot about appreciating the moment that you're in, and we have worked hard as a team. You guys have worked hard as a team for this moment. This is your moment.
The countdown was not easy. Another hydrogen leak required a team to go to the pad inside the blast danger zone to tighten bolts on a valve. The range, who is in charge of tracking the rocket and preventing it from threatening people if it goes off course, had to replace an Ethernet switch. But at 1:47 a.m. Eastern Time, a little behind schedule, Artemis was headed to the moon in a flawless nighttime launch.
The harder the climb, the better the view. We showed the Space Coast tonight. What a beautiful view it is.
And you just heard the roars of excitement and cheers as Artemis is getting higher and higher from everywhere around here at the Kennedy Space Center. Again, right now the teams are working no issues as Orion is on its way to the moon. Live at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Weather First meteorologist Nick Stewart, Iowa's News Now.